try.
Three times the charm, right?
Yeah. So they're all there. I don't know
Well,
why. I was just seeing me.
okay. Well, so we're going to look at chapter 15 today. So before we get into it, actually, talk amongst yourselves for a second. I'm doing a Bible study. I should probably have my Bible, which is kind of funny. You'd be surprised how many Bible studies don't actually have Bibles in them, but that's another sermon. So I want to talk a little bit. So we're kind of moving into another chapter, and in this chapter 15, there's a problem that the church in Antioch, Antioch to the south, not the smaller Antioch in where Paul went on his missionary journey, but the larger city of Antioch, which I think is kind of interesting because growing up in church, I always heard lots about the church in Jerusalem, and never heard anything about the church of Antioch, right? If you're part of an Eastern tradition of Christianity, Antioch is very predominant in their idea of the gospel and in their reading of scriptures. In fact, there's still a Eastern Orthodox church that is the Church of Antioch, which kind of traces their roots all the way back to Antioch. But I just find it interesting that Antioch played such a huge role, that community played such a huge role in the gospel of Jesus being extended to non-Jewish Gentiles. And for most of us, is my connection, am I glitching on you guys?
You froze.
You did there a little bit.
You know what? I'm going to see if this works. I'm going to switch. My Wi-Fi in the office is horrible. So I'm going to switch channels here and see if it makes life a little bit better.
No, you're saying the Antioch that's in what, Turkey or whatever, not the one in Syria.
Right. Let's see here.
So the one in Turkey was smaller than the one in Syria?
Right. So the one where Paul, if you remember our map, when Paul went on the missionary journeys and went from the Mediterranean up over the mountain range and into those cities, there's a smaller city of Antioch there. And that is not the Antioch we're talking about. The other Antioch is the one that is to the east, that is kind of on the mainland north of Jerusalem and that area. Okay, so am I still live?
Yep, you're fine.
You're still live.
Okay, so I switched. We'll see if that makes my connection a little bit better here.
You can ask us if you are.
Yeah. So anyway, this church played a huge role in the message of Jesus going out to the Gentiles, which, I mean, I don't know any of your history. I don't know if you have Jewish roots in your history. I don't. And so this church is a huge player in me receiving the gospel, and all of us who are not part of a Jewish tradition receiving this gospel of Jesus. So I just find that very interesting that in most Western churches, we don't have any kind of frame of reference for this historical community that I think for those of us who are Gentiles, and especially for Protestants, has such a huge role in us being in existence. So that was just free. That was just Pastor Mark's take on this. But the problem that's coming up that we're going to see addressed here is that there's this continuing competition, for lack of a better word, between Jewish believers who have found faith in Jesus and Gentile believers who have come to faith in Jesus. And it's rooted in this, in two things. One, it's rooted in the law of Moses and the law that Jewish people followed. And one of the most important rules was that Jews don't fraternize or associate with Gentiles. You don't eat in their house. They can't come into your house. If you do go into a Gentile's house, there's a ceremony that you had to go through in order for you to participate in worship at the temple. You didn't eat meals with Jewish people because there was always the possibility that you could be eating food that was sacrificed to a pagan god or to an idol or something like that. And so we have these communities now of people who have found faith in Jesus who have Gentiles who are part of them and are part of the community and are sharing life together. And as we've seen in a lot of historical documents of the early church, one of the big ways that they shared life together was that they shared meals together, which according to Jewish law is a big no-no, right? So we've got that problem. We also have kind of an underlying problem that maybe isn't quite as apparent on the surface, but the Jewish understanding of the world is rooted in, I would say almost prehistory, in which there is this idea that not only has God chosen this branch of the descendants of Abraham, who call themselves Jewish, as his chosen people, so they belong to God. But there's also kind of this sense in the Jewish understanding of God that God belongs to them as well. So let me kind of expound upon that a little bit. So like in a lot of the Old Testament stories, we'll see that in neighboring countries or neighboring cities around Israel, other races and other cities and nations had gods. So like we saw the Babylonians predominantly worshipped Baal, right? The Assyrians worshipped Asherah. The Egyptians worshipped Ra, the sun god. Even the Romans had Zeus and their kind of pantheon of gods, right? And so there was this kind of underlying idea that the Babylonians had their god, Baal, and the Jewish people had God Yahweh, right? And so there was kind of their understanding that the God that we're talking about was their God in the midst of all these other gods that were around. And so there was still kind of this, hadn't quite come to a firm theology or understanding that there was really one true God, even though they kind of said that in their heads. Their heart still kind of had this idea that Yahweh was their God and Baal was the Babylonian God. And so not only were they chosen by God, but God was theirs too, right? They kind of had some ownership of him, which then led them to this place, either intentionally or unintentionally, where the Jewish community, and especially the political and religious leaders of the Jewish community, were kind of the gatekeepers of who got to be in relationship with this God, which is part of the reason why there is such an uproar over this idea that that God could love a Gentile the same way that he loves Jewish people. I mean, so that's kind of what's at the heart of it is not only does their law say you're not supposed to fraternize with Gentiles, but there's this understanding that we get to pick who gets to have this relationship with God because he's ours, right? So there's this weird kind of dynamic that's going on that is coming to the forefront as Paul and Barnabas, and especially the church in Antioch, is intentionally telling Gentiles and welcoming Gentiles into their community and telling them about Jesus. So as we start in chapter 15, that's kind of the underlying problem that's percolating that I don't think anybody really saw coming, but they find themselves in it. So let's start here. I'm going to read, I think, the first 5 verses of Acts, and we'll talk a little bit about that. So here we go, chapter 15. Some men came down from Judea to Antioch and were teaching the brethren, unless you are circumcised according to the customs taught by Moses, you cannot be saved. This brought Paul and Barnabas into sharp dispute and debate with them. So Paul and Barnabas were appointed, along with some other believers, to go up to Jerusalem and see the apostles and elders about this question. The church sent them on their way, and as they traveled through Phoenicia and Samaria, They told how the Gentiles had been converted. This news made all the brothers very glad. When they came to Jerusalem, they were welcomed by the church and the apostles and elders, to whom they reported everything God had done through them. So here we have a case that we're going to see happen over and over again as the book of Acts goes on. And I've mentioned it a couple of times in some of our other discussions, that there's this idea or a group of people that we commonly refer to as Judaizers, who will follow along behind Paul or Barnabas or any of the Christian communities that are being formed, and say that none of this counts unless you convert to Judaism and adhere to the law of Moses, which would mean circumcision and dietary laws and all the stuff that is in that law, right? The word that is used says that they can't be saved, and that's a loaded word, especially in 21st century America, right? And so there's some disagreement between commentators depending on what their theological bent is. Some believe that it's the idea of heaven, which the Pharisees, the Jewish leaders at the time, believed that there was a life after death. If you remember when we talked about Pharisees and Sadducees, the Sadducees didn't believe in life after death, but the Pharisees did. And so it's a little bit difficult to know what they mean by saved, if that means you get into heaven afterwards only if you're adhere to the law of Moses, or there's still a large part of the Jewish community that believes that God is going to deliver them and put them back on the map as the major force in the world. And so when revolution happens, if you're not part of the people who follow the rules of God, then you're going to be burned up with the shaft when it hits the fan. You're not going to be on the right side of this revolution. So take that for whatever it's worth. And it's very interesting that this underlying problem is about whether or not Jews could fraternize with Gentiles. And certainly it was a taboo that Jews could not intermarry with any other group. And so it's interesting that as this band of people who are coming down to ask the Supreme Court, for lack of a better word, on a decision about this, it says that they go through Phoenicia and Samaria. And we've talked a little bit about the rift between Samaritans and Jews, which is rooted firmly in the idea that the Jews believed Samaritans were not part of the Jewish tradition, because when the Jews were taken off into captivity, some of the Jews intermarried with other communities and other nations that had different gods. And so they were seen as this apostate group that was not really a pure and was hated by God, right? So it's interesting that as Paul is heading through that region, he's preaching to them that, hey, this faith in Jesus, these people who are experiencing God through Jesus, it's Gentiles, people who the Jews don't associate with, which is something amazing to hear if you are a Samaritan who you've been taught that the Jews hate us because of our history. So that's a significant little, even though it's four words in this chapter, it's a pretty significant thing that Paul does that.
I have a question.
Uh-huh.
And it has to do, I have a question about the geography of all this, because even Steve and Linda will like that I have my Phillips here. And also what you read, it says they went down, people came down from Judea and began to teach the brothers. And then they go down, let's see. They should go up. It says they should go up to Jerusalem with some of their own people. So even the maps show that Antioch is north of Jerusalem. Did they have to have their directions screwed up?
Well, they don't use a Western idea of maps where we say north is up and south is down. they have kind of a different way of using that language. Usually it would refer to influence rather than geographic location, and their maps weren't always oriented towards celestial north like we do today, right?
Okay.
This is
So it's
before modern navigation was there. But it's a really good question, because when I first started studying this, it's hard when you say, you'll read they went up or they went down, and you're like, well, they went left or right. I mean, it's east or west, right? It's not up or down. But when we do that, we're applying a 21st century understanding of navigation and geography that wasn't in place in the first century, right? So yeah, that's part of it. And typically, one of the things that you'll find, especially in biblical literature, is that we apply a lot of geographic kind of things to writings where, and this is going to sound bad, factual things to what we read. And in the early church, and in especially Jewish communities, they were more concerned with relationships, right? So up or down wouldn't necessarily refer to geographic locations. It would more refer to importance of people, right?
Okay.
So when someone says, we went down from Judea to Antioch, there's an implication that the important people from Judea, because they were above, went down to Antioch. And so there's all that kind of, we talked a little bit last week about, when we read things critically, that when we apply 21st understanding to first century understanding of the world and faith, that we get some of those kind of strange things that we have to wade through for it to make sense. Did that help?
Geography is screwed up because
well, that, and another thing that often happens is timelines get really messed up, because we base our timeline on a solar year that revolves, is around the idea that the earth revolves around the sun every 365 days. Jewish calendars are a lunar calendar, which means that things are messed up when we try to compare the two. If we follow the Jewish calendar, Easter, would end up being in December every 17 years or something like that, because it's kind of messed up like that. And then we find, like in Egyptian timelines, a new year starts when there's a new pharaoh, right? So if, say, a pharaoh comes to power on January 1st and then is assassinated on February 2nd, when the new pharaoh comes in, it's a new year. So one year may only be a month and a half, and the next year, would be wherever it starts. So then when we try to go back and say, well, the book says that he was pharaoh for a year, that messes up our timeline when we try to mix the two together. So there's all kinds of things like that when we're doing cross-cultural thing over 21 centuries that we try to backtrack over, right? So
this is a cross-cultural thing too, but you're only a Jew if you're circumcised. That leaves the whole other sects out totally. They're not circumcised.
Yep. Yeah, it's
patriarchal.
It is certainly a patriarchal system, for sure. And as we have seen also, is that there's Jews who believe that they're real Jews because they can look at their descendants and trace it back to the 12 tribes of Israel. And then there are Jews who converted to the faith who were seen as second-class citizens because they were Turkish or Greek or Babylonian or whatever, and don't have roots that go back to Abraham, right? So so there's this chapter doesn't necessarily address that, because they're saying you need to be converted. But I'm cynical enough to know that even if they converted, the Jews in Jerusalem probably would have still treated them as second class, and not real Jews, because you didn't trace your roots back, right? So, and the book of Acts and the gospel use the word Jews as this umbrella statement, which, I want to make sure that we don't come across as anti-Semitic and all of this. It was just their understanding of the world, the same way the Babylonians had their understanding of the world and the Romans had their understanding of the world. So let's make that clear. So let's look then here at the case that Paul and Barnabas and the others make when they get to Jerusalem. We're going to read 6 through 21. If I can find it here. So then some of the believers who belonged to the party of the Pharisees stood up and said, "The Gentiles must be circumcised and required to obey the law of Moses." The apostles and elders met to consider this question. After much discussion, Peter got up and addressed them. "Brothers, you know that some time ago God made a choice among you that the Gentiles might hear from my lips the message of the gospel and believe. God, who knows the heart, showed that he accepted them by giving him the Holy Spirit, just as he did to us. He made no distinction between us and them, for he purified their hearts by faith. Now, then, why do you try to test God by putting on the necks of the disciples a yoke that is neither we nor our fathers have been able to bear? No, we believe it is through the grace of our Lord Jesus that we are saved, just as they are." The whole assembly became silent as they listened to Barnabas and Paul telling about the miraculous signs and wonders God had done among the Gentiles through them. When they finished, James spoke up. "Brothers, listen to me. Simon," who is Paul, again, there's one of our things of same person having 3 names that we have to wade through. "Simon has described to us how God at first showed his concern by taking from the Gentiles a people for himself. The words of the prophets are agreement with this, as it is written, 'After I will return and rebuild David's fallen tent, its ruins I will rebuild and I will restore it, that the remnant of men may seek the Lord and all the Gentiles who bear my name, says the Lord, who does these things that have been known for ages. It is my judgment, therefore, that we should not make it difficult for the Gentiles who are turning to God. Instead, we should write to them, telling them to abstain from food polluted by idols, from sexual immorality, and from meats of strangled animals, and from blood. For Moses has been preached in every city from the earliest times, and it is read in the synagogues on every Sabbath." So here's the case that is made to the leaders, and we have some pretty big hitters who come and make statements in front of this group of elders of the church, right? As we've seen Paul do and Peter do in the past, whenever there's some kind of a disagreement or some question of the rules, they don't make a legal argument in which they say the law says this and we haven't broken the law because we did this, right? I mean, that would be the legal argument where what they do is, instead of making that kind of a legal argument, they just retell what happened. Peter does it when he comes back from Cornelius's house, and this centurion, who's a Roman citizen, comes to faith in Jesus, and he doesn't make a legal argument saying, well, it really lines up with the law this way or that way. He just says, hey, this is what happened. Paul and Barnabas, when they come down from Antioch, do basically the same thing. They just say, this is what happened. We went on this missionary journey, and all these people who have no roots in Abraham or the Jewish traditions have experienced God the same way we have. And so when they make that argument, Peter is the first to stand up, and Peter basically recounts his story of Cornelius for them. Which, remember, now this is the fifth time we've heard that story in the last 5 chapters, and says, hey, when I went to Cornelius and came back and told you about that, we all agreed it was a good thing, and were amazed that God would reach out to Gentiles. In a sense, he's saying, so what's different? What's changed? And so he makes that case in front of the elders. And then James, who is another big hitter, and this is the same James that is commonly believed, this is the same apostle James. It's commonly believed that James is one of Jesus' siblings, and is also the leader of the Jerusalem church, which is why he can kind of stand up and say, here's what I think our decision is, because he's kind of where the buck stops for this church. And I think I've mentioned before that we've come across some documents in recent history, within probably the last 25 years or so, in which we found that James actually probably was a bigger influence in the growth of the early church than Paul was, but James just didn't write letters like Paul did, so we don't have an account of it like Paul did. But James is a big deal, and so James stands up and kind of looks back at the Old Testament and says, hey, the stories that we've been teaching about in the synagogue have told us for years that this was going to happen. And we've told it in all of our synagogues all over the world. And why are we saying that this can't happen? So it's interesting to see how this plays out, because like I said, it's not a legal argument. What in fact they're doing is they're just saying, this is what has happened. And if we all have agreed that this is what God is doing, then you're either going to have to say, God didn't do this, or you're going to have to say that God was wrong in doing this, which puts them in a position of none of them want to say that, right? And so James, so that's kind of the argument that comes out. They can't deny that God is doing this thing. And even though it doesn't line up with their tradition and what they believe that God has told them from the past, that God's doing something, and we shouldn't stop it from happening. I think it's also interesting that Peter and James both, this kind of makes me smile. Peter and James both refer to the law as, Peter refers to it as a yoke. And he says, why should we put this law on these people that you and I and our fathers haven't been able to live up to? Why should we put it on them? And James says basically kind of the same thing of like, why would we make it so hard for them to experience something that they've already experienced? Why are we going to make it tough on them? It reminds me of when I was in seminary, we went to on a field trip in a Judaism and Islam class that I had. And we went up to Toledo, Ohio, and we visited a couple of synagogues, and we went to a synagogue that was pretty large in Toledo, and they had over 100 families that attended the synagogue, and had a huge gathering space that was bigger than any sanctuary I had ever been in. And so we were talking with the rabbi there, and somebody asked the question about, we were talking about the programs they do and how Jewish, synagogues work different than Christian churches do and stuff. And so somebody asked, well, so do you do like any kind of evangelism or outreach or anything like that? And I can still remember this rabbi looking at us and saying, no, we don't really do those kinds of things. And then as he talked, he was hilarious. He's like, I don't understand why people would want to become Jewish, because why would you want to be part of this? And so he talked about like all the rules they had to follow and all the stuff that that they were required with Sabbath laws and dietary laws and kosher meals and all the stuff. And he was like, why would anybody want to be part of this? No, we don't do outreach, because you'd be crazy to want to be part of this, which I think is kind of funny, because that's the same argument that Peter and James just made. Like, if you've already experienced God, why are we going to put this yoke on them that's going to make it even more difficult when they've already experienced it? And so James kind of, in a sense, puts the gavel down and says, so this is what we're going to do. James makes the argument that we're not going to require them to be Jewish and get circumcised and adhere to all of the law. What we're going to do is we're going to tell them to keep doing what they're doing, but encourage them to follow some of these rules that are in the law, because there's a belief that they're good things, whether you're Jew or Gentile, right? And so the things that he tells them to adhere to in this were like not eating food that's been sacrificed to idols, about sexual practices and immorality in their sexual relationships. And there's this thing about blood, eating blood of animals, right? All of these, as I've read through a lot of commentators and done some of the historical work on this, all of these things have a root, at least at this time in history, around worship of pagan gods, right? So obviously the eating food that's been sacrificed to idols, that would be a recommendation to not participate in pagan worship and pagan sacrifices and things like that, or to be kind of unwittingly a part of that. What was a common practice, especially in metropolitan cities, is that merchants would sacrifice an animal to a pagan god, and maybe they would sacrifice the heart or some other part of the animal, and then they would take the rest of the animal and take it to the market and sell it for food. And so people would be buying food that was sacrificed to an idol without ever knowing if it was or not. And so there's this kind of warning of not wanting to unwittingly participate in that. The sexual practices were a large part of a lot of pagan religions. And so a lot of commentators say that this is also a warning of not participating in those things as acts of worship to pagan gods. Temple prostitutes and things like that were still a very common thing in this part of the world. And so there's some belief that this is also kind of a warning about don't give up worshiping the one true God that you've discovered through Jesus by participating in these worship acts to pagan gods. And then the thing about blood, although the Jewish dietary laws have very specific rules about how you drain the blood out of an animal and it's kosher and those kinds of things. For a lot of pagan religions, there was an idea that, and it's not just a pagan thing, I think it was kind of a first century world view, was that blood was life, right? And which obviously kind of makes sense. If somebody bleeds, their life goes away, right? And so there was, in a lot of pagan religions, the idea of, after sacrificing an animal and eating its blood, in a sense, you were consuming life, right? And so, and even in some pretty harsh, human sacrifices, things like that too, there was an idea that that blood carried life, and you could kind of somehow steal somebody else's life through their blood and things like that. So that was a big part of pagan practices as well. So a lot of commentators say that the rules that basically they wanted them to adhere to were things that kept them from reverting back to practices of worship of other gods, and that they would hold strong into their worship of God and through Jesus. So that's the decision that they come up with. This issue is not going to go away. I mean, this is the first time that we see it in kind of a formal way, but we're going to see later that the church kind of in Jerusalem backtracks a little bit on that, and we'll find later, I think it's in chapter 19 or 20, where one of Paul's subordinates on his missionary team, they say he needs to be sacrificed, or he needs to be circumcised and become Jewish if he's going to work with you in this. And Paul says, okay, and he converts to Judaism, which seems to be a direct opposite of what this letter just says. So so political compromise is nothing new. It happened in first century church and happens today. And so we'll talk more about that when we get there. So let's, so any questions about that? I got about 15 minutes left here.
Something that was going through too, I mean, I understand these were rooted in the worship of idol or pagan gods, but did some of their rules also come from like health things? Like they knew if they ate shellfish or whatever, it could, I mean,
that's kind of an age-old argument around the law of Moses, because there's the law, and remember we talked a little bit about how in that there was a scribe and scholarly kind of group of the Jewish people that would read through the scriptures and then convert the scriptures into rules and law, and that was how you showed devotion to God, was by following these rules. So there was 1,000,001 rules. You know, I had a seminary professor one time talk to me about, like, there was a rule that said you can't have sex with bugs. Bugs.
How would you?
Well, I know, and that's kind of what I thought. Like, was that really a problem that they needed to address?
Into the
But-
minutia.
Yeah, right. You know, there's that whole kind of thing that a rule around Sabbath could then grow to this huge. I mean, I think that's why Peter calls it a yoke, because it could grow into this huge thing. And so there's always been this kind of debate about why does God make these rules about food that you can eat, or resting on the Sabbath? Like, is there a reason behind them, or are they just arbitrary laws because God, I mean, is it kind of like mom and dad telling the kids because I said so? Or is there a reason behind it? And so, you know, I've heard lots of arguments that say, well, the kosher, if you eat kosher food, is actually much more healthy than regular food. And, you know, when preservatives and refrigeration and things like that, you know, draining the blood out of an animal reduces the ability for bacteria to grow, and, you know, all that kinds of stuff. So, you know, there could be some arguments made for that. That's when we get to heaven, we can ask God, so what's the deal? Why can't I eat ham? What, why did you say that? So,
You know, if I killed an animal with a shotgun as opposed to cutting their head off.
right. Well,
Or-
and you know,
Was there an actual Jewish law about not strangling animals? Was that?
Yep, that was one of them. Yep.
Okay.
So, you know, I think there's certainly an argument to be made for that, you know, especially like with the rules around, like, knives used for butchering and things like that have its root, you know, that's a cleanliness thing. They had to be cleaned, and you couldn't use them for anything else, and you couldn't, which, I mean, nowadays we would talk about that in terms of cross-contamination, and but in prehistory, that was just the rule that God told you to do, and you didn't know anything about these little microscopic germs that grew on your knife when you butchered an animal or whatever. So
Other than from experience that they learned, ooh, if I did this, we could become sick or
Right.
whatever.
right. And what would often happen is people would say, you became sick because you broke the rule of God. God's punishing you. That's why you got sick. I mean, they didn't have the idea that, oh, there's a reason for this. It's God told you not to do it, and you did it. So yeah, I mean, that's, I think there's, it's interesting that they, and this is also part of, I think, why we didn't see the new Christian church that is growing out of this Jewish tradition. Just what the church could have said was, nope, God's doing this new thing. Don't worry about any of the Jewish tradition. Just go experience God the way you've experienced God, and go with God's grace. They didn't say that. They said, in a sense, there's value in our Jewish traditions, and we want you to observe some of the things that we think are important. And I think that's part of the reason why Christian churches, why we continue to have the Old Testament believed being inspired words of God for us, and that we didn't just jettison that tradition and say, oh, nope, God doesn't care about that anymore, we're going on to something else. I think this is an intervention, so to speak, of the Holy Spirit, of saying the work that God has been doing to reconcile humanity back to himself through all of these centuries is valuable and valid, and we don't just ignore that stuff. It's part of who we are moving into the future. And I think this is a place that sets that precedent as the church begins to grow, instead of just saying, nope, we're something new, forget all you guys, we're going to go do our own thing. You know, I think that is important for us in everyday life, not even religious life, that, you know, what's the rule? If you don't read history, you're doomed to repeat it, right? I mean, it's kind of that same idea. If you just reject the interaction of God with humanity for centuries before this and say it doesn't matter anymore, then you just have to relive it over again until you learn that lesson. And so being able to bring that into their new traditions, I think was important.
I wondered about the drinking blood thing, because eventually when, part of the Eucharist celebration is saying that we're drinking the blood of Christ, it would be
that's a no-no for Jews, right? Yeah.
right. And,
Yeah.
and so I just think it might have come back to haunt them, that admonition about drinking blood, because
Right.
if they're made it an important rite of the church to drink the blood of Jesus. Ooh.
Well, and if you remember, the first time Jesus used that metaphor, a bunch of people said, whoa, 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 you're crazy, too much. And in fact, he lost a bunch of his followers left. So in, I believe it's in Matthew, when he's talking about, unless you're willing to eat my flesh and drink my blood, you can't inherit this kingdom. And a bunch of people said, whoa, I'm out, I'm done. So, there was a couple of times in the Gospels where we see Jesus make statements like that. Even his own family came and tried to interrupt him one time when he was preaching, and his brothers came in and said, Jesus, you're not helping your cause. You're making everybody mad. Maybe you should come home with us for a while. And Jesus obviously doesn't. But so, yeah, I mean, it's our history is all intertwined, and especially when, it's hard to figure out metaphors and literalism. And, if you read scripture in just a literalism way, then you get into that whole transubstantiation thing of, does it really become meat and blood when we eat them, like some traditions say, or is it a symbol of something different and a symbol of life? Is it, whatever. So, let's finish reading. So, let's go ahead and read where were we? I think we're on 21 or 22. So this church council sent a letter back to Antioch, and this is what we find. Then the apostles and the elders with the whole church decided to choose some of their own men and send them to Antioch with Paul and Barnabas. They chose Judas, called Barsabbas, and Silas, two men who were leaders among the brothers. With them, as they sent the following letter. The apostles and elders, your brothers, to the Gentile believers in Antioch, Syria, and Cilicia. Greetings. We have heard that some went out from us without our authorization and disturbed you. So he's talking about the Judaizers who went, troubling your minds so that by what they said. So we all agreed to choose some men and send them to you with our dear friends Barnabas and Paul, men who have risked their lives for the name of our Lord Jesus Christ. Therefore, we are sending Judas and Silas to confirm by word of mouth what we are writing. It seems good to the Holy Spirit and to us not to burden you with anything beyond the following requirements. You are to abstain from food sacrificed to idols, from blood, from the meat of strangled animals, and from sexual immorality. You will do well to avoid these things. Farewell. It's a pretty short, to the point letter, right? So it's a little bit interesting that, and there's some, again, a lot of speculation as to why the church sent Judas and Silas with them. Most believe that it was a way to keep Paul and Barnabas from being accused of lying. So what could have happened is Paul and Silas says, okay, well, we're going to go talk to the elders in Jerusalem about this. And then the elders in Jerusalem could have said, nope, you guys got to be circumcised and become Jews like the rest of us. And then go back and say, nope, they said we can just keep doing what we're doing, and could lie about it. And so this is a way that either Paul or the church in Jerusalem was kind of their safeguard of saying this is so that you can't be accused of lying. Especially since these Judaizers seem to be pretty tenacious, because they're going to follow Paul and Silas and others all over the region trying to undo what they've done. It is also a little bit interesting too that Paul even submits to this idea of taking this to the Supreme Court, for lack of a better word. Paul is known as being this is the way it is, and that's just the way it is. He's not great at compromise. I mean, it's part of the reason why I think a lot of people have a hard time reading Paul today, is because Paul just says this is what the Lord says it is, and tough. If you don't like it, then argue with God. It's not me. He's not kind of the, well, hey, let's see what other people say about it, and let's get a second opinion on this. That's pretty uncharacteristic of Paul. But it is interesting that Paul, who is trained in theology in a school of the Pharisees, and is also trained in the art of argument and rhetoric, is willing to do this. And so my personal opinion is that I think Paul said, hey, when the church hears what's going on, they're going to agree with us, and that's going to just give me even more power in my argument over these Judaizers. So let's go down and let's let them pile on, and we'll let the church in Jerusalem support us as well. And so that's kind of my understanding, because Paul isn't usually the kind of guy who says, well, let's get a second opinion on this. I think Paul kind of knows exactly what's happening there. So that kind of brings an end to that part. Then there's this little, in the last 5 minutes, there's this little end of the chapter here from verse 36 through 41. It says, sometime later, Paul said to Barnabas, let's go back and visit the brothers in all the towns where we preach the word of the Lord and see how they are doing. Barnabas wanted to take John, also called Mark, with them, but Paul did not think it was wise to take him, because he had deserted them in Pamphylia and had not continued with them in the work. They had such a sharp disagreement that they parted company. Barnabas took Mark and sailed for Cyprus, and Paul chose Silas. Silas is one of the elders from the church who came up from Jerusalem. Took Silas and left, after he'd been commended by the brothers to the grace of the Lord. He went through Syria and Cilicia and strengthened the churches. So here we've talked a little bit about how Paul and John Mark have this disagreement. It's interesting that the word that Paul says, I don't want to take John Mark with us because he abandoned us. It's interesting, the word that's used there is apostolon. Now, apostolos means someone who does the work of the gospel. Apostolon means someone who withdraws from the work of the gospel. So when Paul says, I don't want to take him because he withdrew himself from the work of the gospel, there's a sense in which Paul is kind of saying, I don't think he's committed to this work of what we're doing, and I don't want to take him with us. If you remember when we talked about all the reasons why John Mark may have left, either he thought it was too dangerous or he was upset that Paul was in charge instead of Barnabas. This adds a little bit of credence to the idea that John Mark wanted Barnabas to be the one who's in charge, because it seems that Barnabas and John Mark have a friendship that's pretty deep, and Barnabas was willing to say, I'm going to take him with me. And Paul says, no, you're not. And he says, well, then we're going to have to go separate ways. So there is some kind of a camaraderie or a friendship or relationship between these two that seems to be there, that obviously Paul didn't have with John Mark.
I do have a question.
Mm-hmm.
We skipped over 30 through 35.
Oh, did I skip a verse?
Yeah. 30 through 35, that section there, it implies that after preaching for a while, Judas and Silas were sent back to Jerusalem. So how did he get Silas, who was supposedly back in Jerusalem, to be part of his next journey?
Yeah, either he came, I mean, again, the timeline is always fuzzy, whether Silas came back to Antioch or whether Paul recruited and said, hey, I want to send this guy. It says that he waits. Barnabas took Mark and sailed for Cyprus, but Paul chose Silas and
Right.
left.
Already
and
back
stood by
in
the brothers.
Jerusalem, according to the verses up above.
Right. Yeah. So he may have either sent word for Silas or this is the early days of the church in the McMurray mind is it seems that so Paul and Silas have their own adventures, and it seems to me that Silas in this whole discussion that starts with the Supreme Court arguments and then going back up to visit Antioch, Silas seems to be enthralled or excited by what God is doing with the Gentiles. And so much so that he's willing to leave his life in Jerusalem and head with Paul out to the places that Paul has been telling them about and all these things that happened. And it seems to me that this story has infected Silas in such a way that Silas is saying, yeah, when Paul says, I want to take you back and visit these churches that we started, Silas is like, I'm on board, let's do it. And so I kind of love this partnership between Paul and Silas because at its heart, it's that idea of evangelism, that when you hear the story of what these people have experienced, Silas wants to go experience it too. He wants to go and visit these places and meet the people that Paul's been telling him about that did all this stuff. And so I kind of, even though this is a short little passage, I kind of love the fact that Silas agrees and says, I'm on board, let's go do this. But it is also interesting that it says that Barnabas and Mark head to Cyprus, which is, remember, Mark was okay staying around the Mediterranean Sea and kind of that relative safe area. And it says that Paul and Silas go north and go around the mountains and go back to the places that were so dangerous. And so that's kind of interesting as well, that they kind of split into those two. They kind of split the first missionary journey into two halves and go back that way.
Well, my contention just is that it says that they were sent back to Jerusalem. And so he must have recruited Silas from Jerusalem.
Right. And again, one of the things that I think we've talked about before too is when I first read through if you just read this cursory and just read through it, all this sounds like it happened in, like 6 months after Jesus was dead and raised from the dead. Like if you just read through it, it just seems like bang, 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 all this stuff happens. But we've talked about how, at this point, we're looking at like probably 15 years at least have passed before any of this has happened. And the missionary journey took another 2 or 3 years for that to unfold. So I mean, we're considerably removed. So, it may have been that it just says after sometime later, Paul said to Barnabas, I don't know how sometime later is. That could be 2 weeks, or it could have been a year and a half or 2 years. Who knows how much sometime later is. So, Silas could have gone back and forth from Jerusalem to Antioch 3 or 4 times in that time. But yeah. So, and when I'm going to finish with this. So when we, in church, when we try something new and we give it, we're going to try this for 3 months and see if it works. I always get a little perturbed at that kind of thinking, because if the early apostles had said, okay, God, we're going to give you 3 months to prove that this thing that Jesus told us is true, Christianity would have never happened, right? None of this would have happened. So when we apply our timelines to things, especially in a world that is instantaneous, where I can look up anything in the world on my phone in 3 seconds on Google. God doesn't work on Google time. So so I think that's important for us. So I'm going to finish there. When we'll start next week, and we'll get introduced to some more people in this. Timothy comes along with Paul and Silas, and so we'll talk some more about that. And again, another kind of benchmark in the next chapter is Paul has a vision about going to Macedonia rather than going east into what is now China and Asia. So we'll talk a little bit about how that affected kind of the life of the church and the direction that the church grew. But we'll finish here for now, and we'll pick it up again next week.
Thanks again.
Great. Thanks, everybody. Have a
Thank
wonderful
you.
afternoon. Go enjoy the sun.
Oh yeah. You too. All right.
Bye-bye.
Bye.